if I was a dad and I have this child and then at 23 he gets diagnosed with STPD and he's living out on the streets and I can't do anything legally, I can't do anything physically, I literally can't take him, how do I live now? How do I live knowing that my son is gonna likely be on the streets with us? So how does somebody normally find themselves getting the diagnosis of STPD?
A person with schizotypal personality disorder is not going to present for therapy. Okay, so they're entering the mental health service system through some other mechanism. It may be through criminal justice because they're being brought in for their conduct on the street, or being brought in by the police because of, some form of inappropriate behavior in public. It's also quite possible they'd be brought in by a family member, and their behavior may become so unusual at home that the family will try to bring them in. Now remember, once a person's an adult, unless they're a danger to themselves or others, or they're gravely disabled, you can't force them into psychiatric care. So families may actually get very frustrated because the family member who may be schizotypal may be resistant to getting care, because people with schizotypal personality disorder don't tend to have a lot of insight. So they're not saying, oh, I'm having a hard time, or that I'm even suffering. Their suspiciousness may make the world feel like a dangerous place, but they're not putting two and two and saying, oh, and then mental health services will help me. So they will usually enter the system through not self-referral, through something, whether it's family, whether it's criminal justice, whether it is for grave disability, that they're living on the streets and they're slowly less and less capable to take care of themselves. So that's going to be their point of entry. And as a result, the assessment is often going to be done by somebody in more of a triage setting that will make this kind of an assessment. The challenge is that people in triage settings, like emergent settings or acute care settings, don't get a good long look at the person. So they often have to make judgments on the spot. So it's very easy to see how schizotypal personality could get misdiagnosed as a psychotic disorder. Also, they'd have to determine whether or not this person is intoxicated. So they may have to wait for that to abate, which they may or may not have the time to do.
So how do you begin to give somebody this diagnosis?
Again, in outpatient care, you're very rarely going to see this. I'm going to tell you, in my entire training, Kyle, the only time I saw a case of this was when I was in my inpatient training 1,000 years ago, 20 years ago.
Right.
I was, working on a locked unit, and that's the only time I saw it. And this was a person who was in and out of, living on and off the streets, sort of thing. But so you're going to see it if you work in an inpatient unit. You're going to see it if you, again, work in a prison or jail system. Maybe at a community mental health center that might serve, for example, a low-income, residentially unstable sort of a population. Those are the kinds of clinicians who will likely see these clients.
Okay. So once they get that diagnosis, can they recover?
So once a person gets a diagnosis of schizotypal personality disorder, they would need pretty intensive sort of ongoing care, ideally either a partial hospitalization program or an inpatient setting. Well, who's paying for that? Right? And then if they don't want to be there, and they're probably going to be quite suspicious of such a setting, they can sign themselves out. So from a probability standpoint, getting these individuals into care is no small task. Once they're in care, it's quite possible that they'll use a combination of skills training, like giving people life skills, teaching them coping, maybe doing social skills training on the appropriate back and forth of conversation. There may be the use of some psychiatric medications. There may be some group therapy so they can practice social skills. That's in an ideal universe. I don't know that universe. And even when I worked in an inpatient unit, it was an inpatient unit for individuals who had co-occurring medical disorders. So something was wrong with them. Like they had gotten cut and they had an infection or they had diabetes. And so they were in a hospital, a medical hospital with IVs and all of that. So they were only getting their psychiatric care for the period of time they were getting their medical care.
Well, so there are people watching this who have a friend or a family member and they go, oh man, this is that person. They have all 9 of those traits. This is like I am reading the book of my life. I want to get them into care. How do they help?
Kyle, this is the great conundrum of mental health in the United States and in most, sort of countries like the United States. We value our civil liberties greatly, but one of the upshots of that is you cannot force a person into medical or mental health care. If a person wants to say no, they can say no.
But if they're saying, I'm going to kill myself,
then you can put them into care,
can.
72 hours max. And if in 10 hours they say, I want to kill myself, then they're going to let them go. We have a constitution in this country and it guarantees due process. We cannot force a person into treatment involuntarily. I mean, again, it's a right we hold dear.
I understand all that.
But the fact of the matter is, if the family member, and this is a heartbreak for these families.
Oh, yeah.
Because they desperately are saying, if I could get my family member into care. But then we also have the back end issues of even if you got them into care, then there's adherence, taking medication, showing up at therapy sessions, because of their challenges with relationships, with the give and take of sort of the expectations of the world. Things like showing up for appointments gets hard. And that's why really innovative mental health programs, they go out on the streets, they find the person and they sit with them in the street. And that's probably how the services here should be delivered, is finding this individual, finding whatever place you find them if they are living on the streets or living in some unstable setting, or going to their home and bringing the services to them. You may be more likely of succeeding instead of pulling them into a setting where they may feel suspicious, unsafe, unsettled. But those kinds of innovative models, they come up here and there, but it's not systematic by any stretch.
And they're expensive.
They're expensive, and you need the staffing and you need the funding. And these are individuals who usually don't have the funds, so this is coming out of public funds. And so,
if you like psychology and learning about mental health and want to learn more while meeting other people who are interested, explore your membership options using the link below this video or visit medcircle.com.
So this question, I hope, is appropriate, and I really mean it with sincerity, because I'm just thinking what I would be thinking of doing if my family member was in this position. Could you feed into their, you didn't call them delusions, what do you call them?
ideas of reference.
Their ideas of reference, and say, look, there are some people who are after you, but I know a safe place, and it's this inpatient care facility, and they're going to help you learn how you can trick them. Can you trick them?
I think that it's, the suspiciousness is pervasive, and why would they trust you? Because of their relative incapacity for having close relationships, there are not going to be many trusted spaces, including family. In fact, family often gets the brunt of their mistrust because family has the most access to them.
Right.
This is one of those times where you do start wringing your hands. And like I said, there's some really innovative, cutting-edge work that people who do community-based frontline mental health services care. You'll see this happening in skid rows in various cities and that kind of thing. These people are doing, and they're often social workers, doing some really great work here, but it's really about funding, consistency, getting folks out there, like literally finding people and tracking them, like keeping in touch with them. It can be done, but again, once you find them, you can't force them into therapy and you can't force them to take medication. So for the families, I would say on the flip side, that the families themselves may need their own support to deal with the grief and the sadness and the frustration of feeling that they may not be able to help a family member. I mean, they can certainly try to ensure that some level of safety for their family member. They may be able to try to ensure some sort of safe residence for them if they have those resources, so at least they know they're not living on the streets where they're so much more vulnerable to violence and other dangers.
So let's just pretend that for whatever reason, somebody could get into the right care, and they had medication and therapy at their exposure. Right. Would it help?
It would help, but you'd need it to be long-term.
What's long-term?
Forever.
Forever. And what kind of improvement would
you might
expect?
be able to get enough social skills training that you might be able to get them into a job that doesn't have too much stress involved to it, so that they could see it through and start earning some of their own money and being able to engage in some basic self-care. I think there would always be a fair amount of social isolation, but you might be able to, again, enhance some life skills, some social skills, foster independent living in a safe way, and get them engaged in some sort of supportive conversation with someone where it may not be that they're making leaps and bounds, but at least they have a touchstone a few times a week. Those kinds of things are possible. Okay.
What do you suggest that these supporters do? I know go to therapy and lean on your friends and family, but I'm just thinking, if I was a dad and I have this child and then at 23 he gets diagnosed with STPD and he's living out on the streets and I can't do anything legally, I can't do anything physically, I literally can't take him, how do I live now? How do I live knowing that my son is going to likely be on the streets with us?
I mean, Kyle, like I said, I know while it's an unsatisfying answer, things like support groups, your own therapy, talking to people who are going through something similar is a game changer.
Yeah,
because
it
you'd
is.
feel like you're the only person in the world going through this. But if you're in a room of people whose kids may be struggling with severe mental illness, but also maybe living on the streets or in and out of the streets or refuse to stay under the same roof as them, or they did have them under the same roof, but their behavior didn't work, that talking to other people and realizing you're not alone and doing the grief work that needs to be done, the radical acceptance that needs to be done, it's not easy. It's really, really not easy because some of these folks might feel like they've quit their family, but you haven't. I mean, say, how can I be there? And there are also, I would highly advise individuals to reach out to groups like NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, because they're going to have excellent resources on how to be there, what kinds of resources you could bring to bear. Are there any advocacy organizations that can help your cause? So those kinds of groups can become a real tool in being able to help you find the resources you need to help you and potentially help your family member, given some of the jurisdictional issues. Because basically what you're trying to do is enhance the motivation of this individual to go for treatment. It's no different than if you had a family member who's a substance abuser.
Okay, so that is my next question. Is it bad if I give them money and clothes and food while they're living on the street?
I'm loath to call that bad. I think it's I would tell a person to be realistic. Okay, so how are they going to receive this gift? What are they going to do with it? Are they going to receive it without suspicion? It may be that you feel good enough knowing that, like, listen, I know that once a week that I'm giving them, enough food, or at least I know that I've given them a place to stay that has a lock on the door and they are staying in it. I mean, it's
because I wouldn't do that to my brother if he was using drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
But if my brother has this personality disorder and I can't get him into treatment and he's going to live on the street, but I can give an apartment and food and know he's safe and eating, and that's what I can do.
And many families do that. If they have the means to do it, they will.
Okay.
And hope to goodness that they do it and offer to go see them and make sure that they are at least eating or putting food in the fridge or cleaning up their space. That, it does feel like you're a long-term sort of a caregiver for somebody with a severe mental illness, and that's what it looks like.
Yeah,
it's not easy. It's not easy. This is not always a feel-good story. But I mean, I think some people say, am I enabling them? I'm like, no, you may just be keeping them off the streets, which means you're keeping them safe.
Right. Any final thoughts on this disorder?
This is a tough one. This is a more severe pattern than anything we've talked about yet. It's a confusing one, and unlike what feels like the much more purposeful antagonism of disorders like narcissistic personality, this is not that. There's a not getting it in schizotypal personality, like a really restricted capability to have a close relationship, which means they often don't have the tools to be able to communicate, to get their needs met. And so I think in that way, it's a different kind of devastation for their supporters. And it can be a tough life because the world feels so threatening to people who are living with this pattern, or they feel suspicious of the world, or they may not feel comfortable in the world. So it's a tough one. And to many of the other patterns we've talked about, you see higher functionality. We've talked about, for example, we even talk about borderline personality, which is a relatively severe personality pattern. Plenty of people with borderline personality who have rewarding careers and, really are able to take care of themselves. You're going to see that less so here.
All right. Well, I thank you for giving us all of this information. It is valuable. And thank you guys for watching. I'm Kyle Kittleson. And remember, whatever you are going through, you got this.